Next Curve.
Hey everyone, welcome to Next Curve's Rethink webcast and our Analyst Corner. I'm Leonard Lee, Executive Analyst at Next Curve, and today I'm joined by the legendary Bob O'Donnell of Technalysis Research. I got that right.
You did. Thanks, Leonard.
And you are the voice, right? You are the voice. He's got this wonderful radio quality voice. It's amazing stuff. Not only does he sound good, he's also a killer veteran analyst, one of few that I get to hang out all throughout the year. Right, Bob?
Indeed.
Yeah.
And take funny pictures of each other. It's all good.
Yeah. And at analyst briefings, this guy, he asks all the killer questions. So it's really cool. And he's also a fellow musician. As you can see in the back, he has his PRS, which is a beautiful guitar.
Yes,
right?
It's a beautiful guitar. It's Orange Tiger. Very cool.
You're making me jealous. Yeah. Yeah, you're making me jealous. Seriously. But welcome, Bob.
Thank you, Leonard. Thanks for having me. No, it's a pleasure to be here. And so I'll do a little intro. So
please do that.
I'm a guest, So as you said, Bob O'Donnell, president of Technalysis Research, and I'll tell you why that was the case. But I've been an industry analyst for almost 25 years. I clearly started when I was, 15. But anyway, I was at IDC for about 14 and a half years. And almost 10 years ago, it'll be 10 years in December, I started Technalysis Research. And, originally I actually and everybody now kind of calls me Technalysis, which is fine because it's too long otherwise. But when I had the idea for the company, that's the name I wanted. But it turned out there was this fluid dynamics software company outside of Indianapolis, and they were Technalysis. And I'm like, crap. So I had to go with Technalysis Research. Now, good news is I outlasted them. They're gone. And I now own technalysis.com, and it just redirects. So technically, I could be just Technalysis.
Yeah. Well, lucky you. I didn't have luck. Well, I kind of did have luck. Next Curve was available. The .com wasn't. So that's why you have the dash.
There you go.
But hey, Bob, you know what? Thanks for that intro. Again, really glad to have you on. And we were both at MWC Las Vegas 2023. And I'd love to get some of your thoughts on it. I know that you wrote a piece recently, but I thought, hey, why don't we jam on the topic? I think it was an important one for this year's event. I thought was important.
It was important. I was interesting. I might debate you on important. And I think, look, this is some of the dilemma that we're having. I mean, first of all, let's be honest. Crowd was pretty weak. Number of vendors, pretty weak compared to other things, and remember that it didn't used to be called MWC in the US. It was CTIA. It was a completely different animal. And it was a decent size show, but it was always MWC Barcelona that got all the love and the action in the telecom industry.
Right.
And then, the US folks figured out, hey, maybe we can leverage this MWC connection. We'll call it MWC US. I think they initially did. And now the last couple of years, they've done it in Vegas. They did it in San Francisco a couple of times. Yeah. But it's never had quite the impact. And obviously COVID screwed up all the trade show business for everybody.
Right.
But, even I did go last year to the one in Vegas, and I felt like it was bigger last year. Yeah. So and here's the dilemma, I think. And this kind of gets to you mentioned, I just did a column I write for Forbes, amongst other places. And I offered what I consider a sort of a tough but honest assessment of frankly where the whole telco industry is. I mean, when we think about MWC, and by the way, you're going to have to stop me because, man, I'm going to keep going. So just jump in whenever you want to. But when you think about MWC, it's all about the telcos, the big operators, your AT&T, T-Mobile, Verizon, and then all the equipment providers that enable their networks, and then the whole ecosystem around it. That's essentially what the MWC show is. A couple of phone guys used to be there, not so much anymore.
Yeah.
So we're in this weird spot. Here we are, end of 2023, arguably sort of almost 5 years into the 5G discussion. I mean, it didn't really hit till 2019, and most people view telco transitions, the Gs, as a once a decade thing around the beginning of the decade. So 4G was around 2010, 3G was around 2000, not exactly, but pretty close, right? Yeah. So 5G was technically sort of around 2020. But, the difference, there's a couple of things I think that are a little bit different with 5G than they were, for example, with 4G. The hype around 5G was stupendous. And not in always the best way. And I think it served as a huge disservice to the entire industry, because people were promised, stupid stuff. Like, and I've made this comment and I'll say it to my dying day. Whoever came up with the idea of 5G controlled robotic surgery needs to be taken out back and shot. I mean, that's just the worst, stupidest thing ever. Who's ever going to do that? Ever.
Well, especially if it's intercontinental. So
it could be freaking next door. Like, seriously, like, why is that going to happen? Anyway, I mean, literally, like, if you're in the battlefield and you can carry around robotic surgery equipment to save somebody's life, I mean, great, but what's the cost of that equipment? Oh my God. It just, every way you think about it, it's stupid. And then, fully autonomous cars controlled by 5G. Never going to happen. All these other things. And now what's happened, we are in sort of, if you believe in sort of that hype cycle, we are clearly in sort of, I would call, the trough of disillusionment around 5G, because we had this initial burst. And of course, initially it was always, we were talking about frequency spectrum and millimeter wave and blah, 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 and all these things. And here we are in 2023, and what's going on? Well, we all pretty much have 5G phones. In fact, the telcos are all talking, 70% of the phones on their network are already 5G, roughly, and 70% of the traffic, not surprisingly. Roughly. I think 75% of the traffic is 5G, a little bit more. So that transition has happened, but what have we noticed? Well, not much, right? I mean, there's really not much that's happening other than my download speeds are generally faster. Great. I can download things quicker, but it hasn't changed the nature of how I use my phone, what I use my phone for. With 4G and LTE, we saw the birth of things like Uber and other activities and things that dramatically reshaped the landscape. And everybody thought we would get a new set of those with 5G, and we've gotten nothing in that regard. And so I take this all back to say, when I look at where we are and I looked at the show and about what was happening, we're kind of in this weird point where, yes, the networks have transitioned for the most part. And, oh, by the way, they're starting to reduce their spend. I mean, there are still move from non-standalone to standalone, and there are some important details that we can certainly cover. But a lot of the investment's been made. And it feels like we haven't gotten very far. We're just starting to see a little bit of network slicing, and Timo did talk about that, which was cool. And we're seeing, and tied to that is moving to 5G standalone, which is required. A little bit of private networks, but even there, it's slow going. I noted, in this piece that I wrote for Forbes, I mean, so Timo had an event, that we were both at. They had a little analyst breakfast, which was great. And they had an absolutely classic, perfect 5G private network case with Boston Children's Hospital. Great, really good, great example of how you can leverage private 5G, because they even connected their medical devices. I mean, they're doing almost a Wi-Fi like network, but with 5G, because they have these old brick buildings where their call coverage was terrible. The latency on certain medical notifications wasn't good. So it's a great example of why 5G can work in certain situations. The challenge is, it was so cool that they did a press release on it. And, Verizon has done a press release in the past on a single 5G network. So is AT&T. So my take is, this is great, but the fact they're happening one at a time,
Right.
Like, why aren't there
Yeah.
thousands of these? And that's kind of the dilemma we're in. And so it was, to me, it was kind of a, like, hey, we need to take a step back and say, not to say those things aren't important, they're going to happen, but man, they're coming a lot slower, I think, than a lot of people expected. And was the gist of the show for me.
Yeah, and that's why, for all those reasons that you just stated, that's why I considered this year to be an important one, because it really is turning into a year of reckoning, right? And
yes,
exactly to your point, all this hyperbole just inflated expectations tremendously, and now we're dealing with just this massive letdown.
Yeah.
And then, even the operators, when it comes to the topic of 5G monetization, I mean, it's incredible. People are still running around going, well, we haven't figured out the killer 5G app yet. And it's like, well, maybe that's not the point. Maybe the point is, even if you're going to modernize networks, you're going to take advantage of all these capabilities on the endpoints to connect to networks over an air interface in amazing new ways. What have you done to capitalize on that? And a lot of that is really based on the quality of deployments, because a lot of these, like, sort of Star Trek, fantasy scenarios that everyone hyped 5G with require high quality deployments, right? URLLC, all these things, even like the massive machine to machine communications or massive IoT. It requires deployment and coverage and QoD now that which is the new thing that everyone's talking about because of the whole Open Gateway initiative. So these are things that, if you really look at where the state of the industry is, where the state of the operators are with their networks, and the maturity that they've garnered thus far, they still have a really long way to go. You know what I'm saying? And I think that's really what you've reacted to and observed very astutely, I think, Bob. And you kind of told it like it is, and that's how it is, right?
Well, and not only that, yeah, no, you're right. And I mean, I do want to point, I want to give props to, especially here in the US, all three of the big folks, the AT&T, Verizon, and T-Mo, now really have really good 5G coverage. They've all been deploying C-band, the mid-band stuff, which is really the sweet spot. I mean, everywhere else in the world except the US focused immediately on C-band, the mid-band frequencies.
Right.
US was the only one that spent a lot of time early on around millimeter wave. And, to be honest, it became a bit of a distraction, and in such a way that people kind of, it doesn't go very far, and there's a lot of challenges. In certain environments, it's fantastic, but it's sort of like the very cherry on top of a. Yeah,
it's like, and here's the interesting thing. When we were at Snapdragon Summit in 2021, I don't know if you remember, T-Mo had that cake.
Yeah.
The
3-tier cake. Oh yeah,
3-tier cake. The year it was like a year and a half after they took off the top layer. So they got rid of the millimeter wave one. But yeah, you're right. I mean, that's the last phase in your network densification journey. But yeah, go on.
Well, no, I mean, so we got kind of distracted by all that, but now they do have a good network in place. They're moving towards virtualizing the core of the network, and I do want to talk about virtual RAN and Open RAN. That's another huge topic that I also covered. And slowly but surely they're moving to true standalone, because one of the things they did with 5G to make the transition easier was to do sort of a halfway thing, which was called 5G non-standalone, NSA. And the reason they did is because they knew it would take years to really move to a fully 5G native network. And quite honestly, only T-Mo has achieved that. Verizon and AT&T are getting close, but it takes a long time and a lot of effort to do that. And those are things you have to be standalone, for example, to be able to do network slicing, because you have to have the ability to do that across the entire network to assure that capability. And so that's why T-Mo introduced their very first network slicing feature. Although even there, right? They had this security slice, which is not an application I would have ever thought of, but it works. It authenticates devices by using a secure slice. Point is, they've had a standalone network for a year, almost 2 years, and it's only now the first application is showing up. So you got to think, all right, so for Verizon and AT&T, they're still, a year plus out, probably in that range of moving to standalone. Then where are the applications above and beyond that? For the slicing applications, theoretically, there's other things too. So again, it just shows this stuff. It's hard, right? I mean, to be fair to them, unlike hey, if our internet goes down, like I just had a glitching issue, it's no fun. It's not great, but the cellular network has got to be there. Literally, lives are lost if the cellular network isn't there. So the reliability standards for telecom are way higher than anything else. And so they move cautiously. And let's not forget, telcos are utilities. They're really kind of utilities. They're not tech companies. They're kind of this weird hybrid. And sometimes they act like a tech company, but a lot of times they act like a utility. And they move, very slowly as a result. Anyway, it's a...
No, and that's a really excellent point because, at DTW or digital, our friends over at TM Forum, they're... for a couple of years, their mantra has been you need to go from being a telco to a techco, and I wonder whether or not that's sage advice, right?
Well, it's an easy thing to say, and obviously,
what do you mean by techco?
Yeah, well,
what does that imply? And then, what are you insinuating? I think we have to be really cautious about that kind of stuff because, telcos actually are. Despite what people might say, they're pretty good at what they do. Yes. Now, is it difficult for them to change? Yes, because look at any IT organization that has, a large, massive, portfolio of technology. A lot of it is old stuff. And, despite all this talk about cloud computing, everything's going to the cloud, it's not happening that way. And the modernization of these enterprise portfolios, IT portfolios, is taking a long time, and then so if the idea with the techco narrative is that you take what's happening in the IT world and then you impose it on the CT world, then I think that's pretty naive, quite frankly.
Well,
how you feel, but
I agree with you. Some of it has happened. They have moved back to the comment I was making. One of the things they've done, right? It used to be that the telecom equipment world was all proprietary equipment from either Ericsson or Nokia, and then for a while there was Huawei. Of course, that's getting ripped out of the U.S. And then there are a couple of Japanese vendors, and you've got Samsung.
Got to pick it up.
Networks.
Yeah,
but that was all proprietary stuff, and there was a recognition that we needed to move to an open approach to run on standard Intel servers and do this in software. So the idea of virtualizing the VRAN, the radio access network, became a huge deal. And that was a modernization effort. And that has happened. And again, it's taken a while, but it is happening. The next step then was to say, not only that, what we really want to do is we want to move to this idea of open RAN. And the industry has become obsessed. And the government has become obsessed because there was concern about U.S. competitiveness in telco. Because again, the old days, there was Lucent, there was Nortel, there were a bunch of companies that made, that were U.S. based that made telco equipment. Now it's Scandinavia for the most part, with Ericsson and Nokia being Sweden and Finland, respectively. And then, of course, with Huawei in China, that's the geopolitical challenges around that. Samsung in Korea is
Cisco. Come on. Give them a little credit.
Yeah, but Cisco does different stuff. They haven't done the traditional some of that stuff. Not all. Yes, are there a bazillion Cisco switches behind the telco equipment? Absolutely. Yeah. But anyway, so the idea then with Open RAN was, hey, let's take this even a step further. We're going to create this software-based interoperable architecture so that we can plug and play anything from anyone, and it'll be amazing, and it'll open up new opportunities for small companies to play a role in an industry, and it'll make the U.S. competitive again in this area. And conceptually, it's a cool idea. Yeah. But another thing that became very clear at this show, and by the way, and it's, to be fair, Open RAN is independent of 5G. It just kind of pretty much came along at the same time. So they're associated together. But anyway, again, so we're 4 to 5 years into this Open RAN discussion, but it is not happening. It's because people are finding that it's there's so many challenges in making it work. And again, one of the biggest being, I can't guarantee 5 nines of compatibility if I've got, software from 6 different companies and each one is pointing at the other one saying it's their fault. Yeah. And so you have to recognize, hey, maybe this is one of those things that sounded good in theory, but in practice isn't happening. And yet at the show, one of the keynotes that I watched, there was this person from the Commerce Department, and she's in charge of telco regulation and all this stuff. Mm-hmm. And they were like talking about all the funding they're going to provide for Open RAN testing. I'm like, it's too little, too late. It's
exactly. And anyway. I mean, honestly, they could have done the Open RAN community, especially in the United States, a favor by ripping out the Chinese equipment. And
well, yes and no, but I mean, even beyond that, this is like to that next level of interchange of, once I'm software based.
But that's a technological bet, right? The thing is what the Open RAN community need, guys like Mavnir, Parallel, and others, they needed the business. And
that problem is they're not getting the business.
Yeah, well, they're also, we have Chinese equipment still sitting in those networks.
But
so that was one of the markets that they were banking on. If there was that funding that came in, and then those rural operators started to rip and replace the equipment, and so obviously they would still have to bid. But I think what you're talking about with what the FCC representative was talking about was likely more of the technological investments, right, to advance and bring open RAN stuff to parity with like Ericsson and Nokia's kits. Right. That can help. But to your point, Bob, too little, too late. I mean, that stuff is not going to move the needle and then help hydrate the ecosystem, to a point of financial viability. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah, well, exactly. And part of it is the promise of Open RAN was it was going to be cheaper, it was going to be faster, etc. And what's happening? It's turning out to be more expensive,
right?
Not as good, not as fast, I should say, not as reliable. So all of a sudden you look at all those things, you're like, maybe this is not necessarily the way to go. So that's the challenge. And if my one concern, and again, another reason why I was kind of giving a bit of a brutally honest take on things is like, if people are still hanging on to things that maybe it's time to let go of, that can actually be yet another distraction that holds the industry back. Yeah. So that's one of my concerns. And we also haven't seen the move towards, there has been work with some of the cloud guys like AWS and Azure working with telcos. We're seeing some of that, but even they are acknowledging, look, a lot of this has slowed down and they're back to just the basics of, hey, let's just virtualize the network and move it to a software defined network. I mean, that was supposed to be like table stakes of 5 to 6 years ago. And it's kind of like, well, actually, no, that's kind of still where we are. And let's not worry about the other stuff. So that's a little hard.
Yeah. And the odd thing is that the industry is starting to realize that it is about hardware, especially with the RAN. The big deficits that you see technically with a lot of these system architectures on the Open RAN side is really it's the silicon, especially the accelerators and the performance of Open RAN or base DU units, right? I mean, or distributed units. That's really been sort of the big challenge, and it ends up not being so much about software. oddly, the constraints of these environments and the wide range of variety that you see across different edges it ends up that the physical stuff matters.
Well, the physical stuff does matter, but I would debate you on that. I do think, and my sense in talking with the NVIDIAs of the world and Marvell and some of the companies making this silicon to accelerate some of the software-defined things, the silicon has been okay. They've had to make that software more efficient, and that's really been their challenge to do that. And then you're seeing a lot of players doing the acceleration, but that software stuff, again, to get the reliability and the performance that they needed has been harder than they expected. And it's taken them a long time.
Right. But that's at a very low level, right?
Well, it is, but yeah.
Yeah. I mean, we're talking like, firmware kind of level, or, I mean, it's like, it's in the weeds. I mean, when we usually talk about like software defined, we're saying, hey, we're going to virtualize the appliance or the server or large units in the network, and then be able to then virtualize the network. So, doing like sort of a systems of systems virtualization, you have the entire network software defined, and you can do all the fancy stuff that everyone talks about. And so I mean, what was one of the big announcements was, I think, Samsung Networks. No, NTT Docomo. It was like a press release from NTT Docomo and NVIDIA that they launched the first GPU accelerated 5G network. But then when you look at the role of if you drill into the details a little bit, the NVIDIA stuff is actually a pretty narrow part of the overall software defined network stack. There's a lot of other bits and pieces, but the challenge I'm sure that NVIDIA had was figuring out, well, how do we build that software so that we can get our GPUs supporting these L1 processing workloads. And that takes domain expertise, right?
Well, it does, and they initially announced Ariel, which is the software platform that NVIDIA has for the L1 acceleration with GPUs, like 2 years ago. So it's it's taken a long time. And this first deployment with NTT is cool, but it's kind of basically a POC. It's a proof of concept. They're putting it out there, and they're gonna they're working to make it happen.
Yeah,
but again, they're
a long time coming too, because I mean, they first announced EGX for RAN almost 4 years ago, if not more.
Right,
like 2019 or some. Yeah,
I don't remember the exact time, but the point is, again, all this stuff is proving to take much longer, and it's proven to be harder to do. And again, it's been tough to match the dedicated ASIC silicon that the Ericssons and the Nokias of the world have been doing. And so that's what you're seeing some of these guys start to do is leverage those things, but build the software tools that lets them do all the basic stuff that the underlying stuff of the network, to jump from cell to cell and maintain connections and all the things, all the magic that happens behind the scenes that just makes our mobile phones work, whether we're going on a train at 100 miles an hour, or we're sitting in our house, or we're in the middle of Timbuktu and there happens to be a cell tower nearby, and all this stuff just works. But anyway, it's again, back to my point is, I think there was a bit of a reckoning on the Open RAN discussion at this show totally as well. Agree. And so you put that together with the other things, and it just feels like, okay, we're kind of moving along relatively slowly. And that raises a question, which I didn't talk about in the article, but I'd love to get your take on this as well. I mean, I talked at the beginning about how every G has been kind of a 10-year phenomenon.
Yeah.
But the rate at which 5G is moving, or perhaps not moving, combined with some of the physical challenges that some of the technologies being touted for 6G inherently have, things like terahertz and all this kind of other stuff, terahertz signaling, that is. it does make you wonder, like, why does it have to be 10 years? Maybe 5G should actually go for 15. Maybe because I got to tell you, every time I hear somebody say 6G, I cringe. I shudder because I'm like, man, we are so far from being ready to talk about 6G, and there's so many challenges still with 5G.
Oh yeah.
And let's, give it a chance to kind of hit its stride. I mean, I know the industry, it's a tough trade-off because evolution is moving forward and people have kind of gotten used to these habits, but there is something to be said that maybe we have to rethink this because there are other challenges. Like you brought up IoT earlier. The reality is most IoT that's happening today is still 4G. The vast majority is still 4G. There isn't really a good solution for 5G because the radios to transmit 5G signals are much more power hungry. And of course they're much faster, but that's not really important for IoT. For IoT, it's all about power consumption, and 4G LTE is just fine. Thank you very much. And they've been able to develop these radios that run at extraordinarily low power. And so, even a lot of those cases are sticking with 4G and only very slowly going to move to 5G. At some point, there are certain benefits you can get. But again, all of these things are proving to take longer than I think people initially thought. So does that mean we need to reset the time frame for the evolution of mobile generations?
Yeah, maybe. I mean, what's certain is that there's a digestion issue. I think operators can only digest so much. And when you look at the 5G roadmap, it's pretty aggressive. I mean, there's a lot of really cool stuff there that we could be working on for years beyond at the end of the decade. So I think you're spot on. And that's the dilemma right now. What is 6G? And I was really unimpressed with the ITU's IMT 2030 vision document. I
didn't see it.
Had no substance. Yeah, there was no substance in it. And I don't think, I think people were just throwing whatever they could in there. I mean, that's like massive materials, new surfaces. Yeah, okay, that sounds really great, but it also sounds really expensive to implement. I mean, coating an entire side of a building with some sort of special active reflective material. I mean, that sounds great. How are you going to make it happen
for the one building that you can do it on?
So, and then for what? So that you can direct beams, millimeter wave beams, and then hey, maybe there isn't anything wrong with making millimeter wave a 6G thing.
I think that ship has already sailed, but they're going to optimize for higher frequencies. That's what a lot of the 6G discussion has been. Apparently, it's not all terahertz, sub terahertz. Now they're saying, which is hundreds of gigahertz instead of like the 26 to 32 and 44 that a lot of the current millimeter wave is.
Yeah, but I think the bigger question that needs to be asked is bandwidth for what? Well,
I mean, look, I will say, I mean, you and I say that, and I get it, but people always, I mean, how many, what's the famous Bill Gates quote? Who's ever going to need more than 640K of memory? Or who's ever going to need more than, XYZ size of a hard drive? Right? I mean, stuff happens. Applications come up. They get developed. Things change. AI has massive data demands. And so if we're going to see generative AI kinds of applications going on all the time, all of a sudden you're going to find a need for some of these pipes and a faster and bigger pipes. So I wouldn't count that out yet. It's easy to kind of sit right now and say, I don't see anything, but that's happened before. So I'm in on the notion of the need to keep being creative and find very clever ways to do this. But there is a question of sort of degree.
Yeah. But I still think you do need to ask the question for what, and if you don't have a right answer, that answer will be imposed on you at some point. Because I think that one of the things you hear all the time in the telco industry is, they say that, 4G allowed the app economy to happen. But when you
Yep.
really think about what was transformative, it ended up being this one app, which was FaceTime. And remember, when FaceTime first came out, you could not use it over a mobile network.
Yep.
But then it became so popular and you saw so many other fast followers come into the market. All of a sudden, everybody wanted to use this thing mobile. We all did, so that we can connect with our families when we're remote and be able to, use this application on a mobile network. And guess what? That drove a lot of traffic into the network. And then the operator said, hey, let's go with this. We can charge, higher tariffs on our plans, et cetera, et cetera.
I will say monetization of these faster speeds has been a big problem.
Yeah,
because you're right. Now everybody's downloading, full on, not just a single Netflix movie. It's like, no, man, I want the whole series. Like I need 3 seasons of, 10, 15 episodes each. And that's what they're going to download. So, The demands they do grow, and yet you don't pay any more for that. And early on, if you'll remember, there was a big debate. Like, are they going to charge extra for 5G service? Like if I have a 5G phone, am I have to pay $10 a month extra because it's 5G? And in the end, none of the carriers did that. And yet here we are, and now we have all these unlimited plans and people are soaking up, they are taking advantage of these faster connections. And, look, the reality is, we can sit here and pontificate all we want, but, for a lot of people, hey, the fact that they can get these kind of speeds is a big deal because, LTE was always 40 or 50 megabits per second, maybe. And now we're at, gigabits per second. And not necessarily not
mobile, everywhere, someplace.
But hundreds of megabits per second is not at all uncommon. And that's a huge jump. Now, the problem is, again, the carriers haven't really, all they're saying is like, oh crap, now, I got more traffic on my network. So that's more for me to manage and I'm not getting paid for it necessarily. So that's been the sort of the business dilemma for the carriers. And that's why everybody wanted all these new 5G applications that they could, in fact, charge extra for. Yeah. That's why private 5G and slicing and some of these other things, they're hoping they can. And obviously, private 5G, they're certainly going to, because that's a separate service that they set up.
Yeah.
Slicing, we'll see how that works and how they're going to do that. It'll be interesting. But again, I think we'll start to eventually see some of the things we were promised. It's just, when they don't show up for 8 years or 9 years, that feels kind of old. Right? Yeah. So maybe, again, let's pull back on overpromise. Let's underpromise and overdeliver instead of the reverse.
I like that. That's a much safer approach. But hey, Bob, I really want to play your guitar, man. One of these days, I gotta just come over to your house and like freaking jam on it.
All right, sounds good, Leonard.
Yeah, well, hey, this is really fun. This is really great. I love arguing with you.
I didn't let you get a word in edgewise.
It's good stuff, excellent. So, hey, everyone, remember to check out, follow Bob. Bob, where do they follow you?
Yeah, it's Bob D Tech on the dying Twitter platform, or X, or whatever the hell it's called. And it's just Bob O'Donnell on LinkedIn, just BOBODONNELL.
Yeah, and then check out Technalysis Research. I assume it's www.technalysisresearch.com.
And now I own technalysis.com, and it'll just automatically redirect. So that makes it a little bit easier.
Yeah.
It's not tech analysis. Everybody spells it wrong. There's no A in the middle. It's just tech and then analysis.
Anyway. Yes. See, I got that. And also, like he said, he writes for Forbes. So check out his column.
Forbes, USA Today, Seeking Alpha, TechSpot, and then, of course, on LinkedIn as well.
Yes. And he's also on LinkedIn. Yeah, he publishes on LinkedIn. So make sure to follow Bob. And it was fun. Bob, really glad that we had a chance to have you on. And thanks everyone for joining and listening in on this conversation with Bob O'Donnell of Technalysis Research. And make sure to subscribe, like, all that nice social stuff, and follow us at www.next-curve.com. Also, subscribe to my newsletter on LinkedIn. And, also subscribe to the YouTube channel that you're probably listening or watching us on. And so with that, hey, Bob, awesome having you on. You're awesome, dude. You're awesome.
Thanks, Leonard. Appreciate it.
I'm going to see you soon.
I was just saying, I'll see you in the next couple of days or next week. I know one of the two. I know.
Yeah. All right. Okay. Take care, Bob. Thank you so much.
Sounds good. Thanks, Leonard. Take care.